Introduction. Hi, I'm Daniel, and I'm excited to share my journey of learning English with you. Not too long ago, the idea of speaking English felt like an impossible dream. I remember those days clearly. I would sit in my small room, surrounded by textbooks and notebooks, feeling overwhelmed by the sheer amount of work I had ahead of me. It was as if a giant wall stood between me and the world I wanted to explore, and that wall was made up of words I didn't understand and sentences I couldn't form. Back then, every time I tried to listen to English, it sounded like a blur of sounds that I couldn't make sense of. Watching movies without subtitles? Forget it. Even simple conversations were a struggle. I couldn't follow along when people spoke quickly, and I found myself nodding and smiling, pretending to understand when, in reality, I was lost. The thing is, I knew how important English was. For as long as I could remember, I had dreams of traveling to new places, meeting people from different cultures, and advancing in my career. But all of those dreams seemed out of reach without English. I needed it to communicate with colleagues at work, to navigate through different countries, and even to enjoy things like reading books and watching shows in their original language. It felt like English was the key to a door that led to so many opportunities, and I didn't have it. I remember sitting there, thinking about all the things I wanted to achieve, and feeling a mix of frustration and determination. I had to do something, but where was I supposed to start? I didn't know anyone who could guide me, and the more I thought about it, the more daunting it seemed. The fear of failure was real. I worried that I wouldn't be able to learn, that I'd always struggle, and that I'd never reach my goals. But deep down, I knew I couldn't let that fear hold me back. I couldn't ignore the importance of English any longer. It was time to take the first step, no matter how small, and begin my journey. And so, with a mix of uncertainty and hope, I decided to dive in, determined to turn my dream into a reality, one word at a time. As I sat there, thinking about the obstacles in front of me, I began to realize something important. If I truly wanted to achieve my dreams, I had no choice but to learn English. It wasn't just a skill, it was the key to unlocking a future I'd always imagined for myself. Every time I pictured what my life could be like, English was at the center of it. I could see myself walking through the streets of cities I'd only read about, ordering food in a bustling cafe in Paris, or asking for directions in New York. I imagined meeting people from different cultures, exchanging stories and ideas, and forming friendships that would span continents. These were the things that excited me, the things that made me want to get up every morning and push forward. But it wasn't just about travel and new experiences. I knew that learning English could open doors in my career as well. I dreamed of working in an international company where English was the bridge between colleagues from all over the world. I wanted to be part of a team that solved problems, innovated, and created something meaningful. But to do that, I needed to communicate effectively in English. I needed to be able to express my ideas clearly, understand what others were saying, and contribute to discussions with confidence. These thoughts fueled my determination. I knew that learning English was no longer just an option. It was a necessity. It was the path to the life I wanted, and I couldn't let anything stand in my way. I needed to take action, and I needed to do it now. So, I made a plan. The first step was to enroll in an English class. I found a local language school that offered evening courses, perfect for fitting into my schedule. The first day of class was nerve-wracking. I walked into the room feeling like a fish out of water, surrounded by other students who seemed more confident, more prepared. But I reminded myself why I was there. This was the first step on my journey, and I couldn't let fear stop me. Next, I bought a few books that were recommended by my teacher, simple grammar guides, vocabulary books, and a couple of short novels written for beginners. I spent my evenings and weekends poring over these books, trying to absorb as much as I could. It wasn't easy. The grammar rules were confusing, the vocabulary overwhelming, and every sentence I read felt like a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. I knew I needed more exposure to the language, so I turned to the internet. I started watching English videos online, everything from tutorials and documentaries to interviews and movie clips. But at first, it was like trying to tune into a radio station with poor reception. The words flew by too quickly, blending together into a blur of sounds that were impossible to decipher. I'd pause and rewind, trying to catch individual words, but it was frustrating. My brain wasn't used to processing English at that speed, and it felt like I was drowning in information I couldn't grasp. Despite the challenges, something inside me wouldn't let me give up. I reminded myself of my goals, the places I wanted to go, the people I wanted to meet, the career I wanted to build. I knew that every minute I spent struggling with English was a step closer to making those dreams a reality. I was determined to keep going, no matter how difficult it seemed. I understood that learning a language wasn't going to happen overnight, but I was willing to put in the effort. Each day I pushed myself a little further, knowing that one day it would all start to make sense. And so, with each video I watched, each page I turned, and each class I attended, I felt a small spark of progress. It was slow and often frustrating, but I was moving forward. I was on my way to becoming the person I wanted to be, and that was all the motivation I needed to keep going. As the days turned into weeks, my motivation became a powerful force driving me forward. Each time I felt overwhelmed, I would close my eyes and picture myself achieving my goals. I imagined standing in a meeting room, confidently presenting my ideas to colleagues from around the world. I saw myself sitting in a cozy cafe, chatting with new friends I had made while traveling, our conversation flowing effortlessly in English. These visions of my future weren't just daydreams, they were my fuel. I started setting small goals for myself. I challenged myself to learn 5 new words every day, to finish reading a chapter of my book without looking up every other word, and to understand just a little bit more of each video I watched. It was these small victories that kept me going. Every time I learned a new word or understood a phrase without needing to translate it in my head, I felt a surge of pride. These moments reminded me that progress, no matter how slow, was still progress. But there were still days when doubt would creep in, when I would question whether I was truly making any headway. On those days, I would remind myself of why I started this journey. I wasn't just learning English for the sake of it. I was doing it to build the life I wanted. I was doing it for the future I dreamed of, for the opportunities that were waiting for me on the other side of this challenge. In those moments of doubt, I would also look back at how far I'd already come. Even though the road ahead was long, I had already taken the most important step, the first one. And as long as I kept moving forward, no matter how slowly, I knew I would eventually get to where I wanted to be. With that thought in mind, I pushed forward, more determined than ever to conquer the language that once seemed so out of reach. The first few weeks of my English learning journey were some of the hardest I've ever experienced. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality of just how difficult it was to break through the barriers of a new language. Every day felt like an uphill battle, and more often than not, I found myself struggling just to keep up. Pronunciation, for example, was a constant source of frustration. No matter how many times I listened to a word, trying to imitate the sounds, they just wouldn't come out right. The English the sound, in particular, was my nemesis. I couldn't seem to get my tongue in the right position, and when I did, it felt so unnatural that I would stumble over my words. I would practice in front of the mirror, repeating words and phrases until my mouth felt numb, but still the sounds wouldn't flow naturally. I could hear the difference between my attempts and the way native speakers pronounced the words, and it made me feel self-conscious. Each time I tried to speak, I was painfully aware of my mistakes, and it embarrassed me. I worried that people would judge me for my accent or misunderstand me entirely. Then there was grammar, an endless maze of rules and exceptions that seemed impossible to navigate. I spent hours trying to wrap my head around verb tenses, articles, prepositions, and sentence structure. Every time I thought I had something figured out, I would come across a sentence that broke the rules I had just learned. I would mix up my tenses, use the wrong prepositions, or forget the proper order of words. The sheer complexity of English grammar was overwhelming, and I often felt like I was drowning in a sea of rules that I couldn't master. Speaking with others was another major challenge. In class, when it came time for conversation practice, I would freeze. It was as if my brain went blank the moment I tried to speak. I knew the words. I had studied them, written them, and repeated them, but when I needed them, they seemed to vanish. I would struggle to string together even the simplest sentences, fumbling over words and hesitating as I searched for the right phrases. My classmates seemed to find it easier, and I envied their fluency. They would converse effortlessly while I sat there, paralyzed by my fear of making mistakes. It wasn't just in the classroom either. When I tried to use English outside of class, the same thing happened. Whether I was asking for directions, ordering food, or attempting small talk, I would stumble over my words, my nerves getting the better of me. My heart would race, and my mind would spin as I tried to remember the right words, the right grammar, the right pronunciation, all while under the pressure of a real-life conversation. The fear of saying something wrong or being misunderstood was so intense that I often found myself avoiding speaking English altogether. It was easier to stay silent than to risk embarrassment. There were days when the challenges felt insurmountable, when I would sit in my room after a particularly difficult class, feeling defeated. The progress I had imagined seemed so far out of reach, and I would wonder if I was really cut out for this. Maybe I wasn't as capable as I thought. Maybe learning English was just too hard for me. Those were the moments when doubt would creep in, whispering in my ear that I should give up, that I would never really master this language. But as much as I was tempted to quit, I knew deep down that giving up wasn't an option. I had already invested so much time and effort, and I couldn't let all of that go to waste. More than that, I knew that if I quit now, I would regret it later. I would always wonder what could have been if I had just pushed a little harder, stayed a little longer. I didn't want to look back on this period of my life with regret, knowing that I had let fear and frustration stop me from achieving my goals. So, even on the toughest days, when it felt like I was making no progress at all, I reminded myself of why I started this journey in the first place. I held on to the vision of my future, the dreams that had inspired me to learn English, and I told myself that the only way to make those dreams a reality was to keep going. Even when it felt like I was moving backward, I knew that each challenge I faced was a necessary step on the road to success. And so I resolved to face those challenges head on, no matter how difficult they were, knowing that every struggle brought me one step closer to the person I wanted to become. After battling through those initial weeks of frustration and doubt, I came to a crucial realization. If I wanted to succeed in learning English, I needed a better plan. The random, unstructured approach I had been using wasn't enough. It was clear that just attending classes and hoping to absorb the language wasn't going to get me where I wanted to be. I needed a strategy, a systematic way to build my skills and gain confidence. So, I sat down and began to craft a plan that would work for me. One that would allow me to make steady progress, even if it was just a little bit each day. The first thing I decided was to make English a part of my daily routine, no matter how busy I was. I realized that consistency was key. It wasn't enough to practice only when I had a full hour or when I felt particularly motivated. Instead, I committed to practicing every single day, even if it was just for 10 minutes. I started small, knowing that it was better to do a little bit every day than to overwhelm myself with too much at once and risk burning out. My new mantra became, "A little progress each day adds up to big results." One of the first tools I incorporated into my routine was flashcards. I knew that expanding my vocabulary was essential, but I also knew that simply reading lists of words wouldn't be enough. I needed a way to actively engage with the language, to make those new words stick in my memory. Flashcards were perfect for this. I started by creating a set of cards with the most common English words and phrases, writing the English word on one side and the translation or definition on the other. I carried these cards with me everywhere I went, on the bus, during lunch breaks, even while waiting in line at the grocery store. Whenever I had a spare moment, I would pull out my cards and quiz myself. Over time, I began to notice that the words I had struggled with were starting to come to me more naturally. It was a small victory, but it gave me the confidence to keep going. In addition to flashcards, I sought out ways to immerse myself in English as much as possible. One of the most enjoyable methods I found was listening to English songs. Music had always been a passion of mine, so it seemed like the perfect way to combine something I loved with my language learning goals. I started with songs that were slower and had clear lyrics, so I could focus on understanding the words. At first, I would listen to the song several times without looking at the lyrics, trying to catch as many words as I could. Then, I would look up the lyrics and read along as I listened, pausing to translate any unfamiliar words or phrases. Finally, I would sing along, trying to mimic the pronunciation and rhythm of the singer. This not only helped me improve my listening skills, but also made learning English fun and enjoyable, something I looked forward to rather than dreaded. Movies and TV shows also became a major part of my learning strategy. I knew that watching content in English was one of the best ways to hear the language in context, with all its nuances, idioms, and natural speech patterns. However, I quickly realized that jumping straight into watching movies without subtitles was too challenging for me at that stage. So, I started by watching movies with English subtitles. This allowed me to match the spoken words with the written text, helping me to understand the dialogue and pick up on new vocabulary. I would pause frequently to repeat phrases, practicing my pronunciation and trying to mimic the intonation of the actors. Over time, I began to recognize common phrases and expressions, and I felt a sense of accomplishment every time I understood a scene without needing to rely on the subtitles. But perhaps the most important and transformative step I took was to start speaking English with native speakers. This was by far the most intimidating part of my plan. The thought of putting myself out there, of speaking English in front of people who were fluent, terrified me. I was afraid of making mistakes, of embarrassing myself, of being judged. But I knew that if I wanted to improve, I couldn't avoid this step. So I pushed myself to take the plunge. I started small, engaging in brief conversations with my English teacher after class or with classmates who were more advanced. These interactions were nerve-wracking at first, but I quickly realized that the fear of making mistakes was holding me back more than the mistakes themselves. The truth was, the more I spoke, the more comfortable I became. I began to see mistakes not as failures, but as opportunities to learn. When I made an error, whether it was using the wrong word or mixing up my tenses, I would take note of it, ask for clarification, and try to correct it in the future. I found that native speakers were often patient and encouraging, appreciating my efforts to learn their language rather than criticizing my errors. As I continued to practice speaking, I noticed a gradual shift in my confidence. Conversations that had once left me tongue-tied started to feel more natural. I no longer hesitated as much when searching for the right words, and I found myself able to express my thoughts more clearly. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and that progress motivated me to keep pushing forward. In time, my daily practice, whether it was through flashcards, music, movies, or conversations, started to pay off. I could feel my understanding of English growing stronger, and with it, my confidence. The challenges I had faced in the beginning, pronunciation, grammar, and speaking, were still there, but they no longer felt like insurmountable obstacles. Instead, they became milestones on a journey that I was finally beginning to enjoy. The most important lesson I learned during this phase was that language learning is not about perfection. It's about persistence. Every mistake, every struggle, and every small victory was a step forward. And as long as I kept moving forward, I knew I was on the right path. My plan was working, and with each passing day, I felt more and more certain that I would reach my goals. There comes a moment in every learner's journey when all the hard work, the hours of practice, and the countless challenges suddenly converge into a single transformative experience. For me, that moment came on an ordinary afternoon in an ordinary cafe, a moment that would forever change the way I saw my progress in learning English. It was a quiet day, and I had decided to take a break from my studies and treat myself to a coffee. I found a small table in the corner of the cafe, took out a book to read, and settled in. The cafe was bustling with people. a mix of locals and tourists, and the hum of conversation filled the air. Normally, I would have tuned it out, focusing on my book or simply enjoying the ambiance. But that day, something was different. As I sat there, sipping my coffee, I caught snippets of a conversation at the table next to mine. The voices were speaking in English, and before I realized what was happening, I found myself listening in. At first, it was just a few words here and there, nothing unusual. But then, as the conversation continued, I noticed something remarkable. I wasn't just catching isolated words or phrases. I was actually understanding what they were saying. The conversation flowed naturally, and to my surprise, I could follow along. They were talking about their plans for the weekend, discussing places they wanted to visit, and sharing stories about their travels. And I understood most of it. I couldn't believe it. It was as if a switch had flipped in my brain, and suddenly, all the hours I had spent practicing and studying were coming together. I sat there, pretending to read my book, but my mind was racing. I was hearing English, real English, spoken at a normal speed, and I was understanding it. The realization hit me like a wave. All the hard work was finally paying off. For the first time, I felt like I was truly engaging with the language, not just as a student, but as a participant in the world around me. As I left the cafe that day, I couldn't stop smiling. I replayed the conversation in my head, marveling at how much I had understood. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. It was the breakthrough I had been waiting for, the moment when everything started to click, and I could see just how far I had come. A few days later, this newfound confidence was put to the test. I had arranged to meet a friend from another country, someone I had met through my English class. We had agreed to speak only in English, as a way to practice and challenge ourselves. We met at a park, and after the usual greetings, we sat down on a bench and started talking. At first, I was nervous. Despite the breakthrough at the cafe, I still doubted my ability to hold a full conversation in English without freezing up or making too many mistakes. But as we talked, something surprising happened. The conversation flowed naturally. We talked about everything, our classes, our families, our hobbies, and our plans for the future. The words came to me more easily than ever before, and even when I stumbled or made a mistake, I didn't panic. I corrected myself, or sometimes just let it go, and kept the conversation moving. We talked for almost 30 minutes. It wasn't a perfect conversation. I made a few mistakes, forgot some words, and occasionally struggled to express myself the way I wanted to. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that I had done it. I had held a real conversation in English with another person for half an hour, and I had enjoyed it. As we wrapped up our conversation, my friend smiled and told me that my English had improved a lot. Hearing that felt like a validation of all the work I had put in. It was one thing to notice progress on my own, but to have someone else recognize it was incredibly rewarding. I realized that I had reached a significant milestone in my journey, a point where English was no longer just a subject I was studying, but a language I was using, living, and experiencing. That day marked a turning point for me. The fear and hesitation that had once held me back began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of confidence. I started to see every conversation, every interaction in English, as an opportunity rather than a challenge. I sought out more chances to speak, whether it was with friends, teachers, or even strangers. I stopped worrying so much about making mistakes and focused more on communicating, on connecting with others through the language I had worked so hard to learn. This breakthrough didn't just change the way I approached learning English, it changed the way I saw myself. I was no longer just a student struggling to learn a difficult language. I was someone who had faced the challenges, persevered, and come out stronger on the other side. I had proven to myself that I could do it, and that realization gave me the confidence to keep pushing forward. Looking back, I can see that this breakthrough was the result of all the small steps I had taken along the way. The daily practice, the flashcards, the music, the movies, the conversations. Each of those steps had brought me closer to this moment, and each of them had played a role in helping me reach this milestone. The journey wasn't over. There were still more challenges ahead, more things to learn, and more progress to be made. But now, I knew that I could do it. I had experienced the joy of understanding, the satisfaction of communicating, and the thrill of reaching a goal I had once thought was out of reach. In that moment, I realized that learning English wasn't just about mastering a language. It was about growing, learning, and discovering what I was truly capable of. And that, more than anything, made all the hard work worthwhile. As I reflect on my journey of learning English, I realize that this experience has been about so much more than just memorizing words and grammar rules. It's been a profound exploration of practice, persistence, and the importance of believing in myself. Every moment, from the struggles of pronunciation to the triumph of my breakthrough conversations, has contributed to my growth, not just as a language learner, but as a person. I used to think that mastering a language was simply about acquiring a set of skills and knowledge, but I now understand that it's about so much more. It's about immersing yourself in the language and culture, actively engaging with it every day, and embracing the learning process with an open heart and mind. I've learned that each practice session, each song listened to, and each conversation held was not just a task to check off my list. They were opportunities for growth, moments that brought me closer to fluency. Persistence was my greatest ally. There were days when I felt like giving up, when the challenges seemed overwhelming, and when my progress felt painfully slow. But during those moments, I reminded myself of my goals and the dreams I had for my future. I learned that every step forward, no matter how small, was a reason to celebrate. Each time I made a mistake, I began to see it as a stepping stone rather than a setback. I realized that every mistake was, in fact, a valuable lesson that brought me one step closer to success. To anyone who might be reading my story, I want you to know that if I can do this, so can you. The journey of learning a language is not a straight path. It's filled with twists, turns, and unexpected obstacles. But the key is to keep moving forward, even when it feels challenging. My advice is simple. Don't give up. Keep practicing, keep trying, and don't be afraid to make mistakes. Every time you stumble, remember that you're not failing, you're learning. Every mistake is a step closer to success, a building block that strengthens your understanding of the language. As I look to the future, I'm filled with excitement and anticipation. I'm eager to continue improving my English and to explore new ways of using the language. Whether it's traveling to new countries, meeting people from different cultures, or engaging in professional opportunities, I now have the tools and the confidence to seize those experiences. The world feels more open and accessible, and I'm ready to embrace it fully. But I also know that this journey isn't over. There's still so much more to learn, and I'm committed to making English a lifelong companion. I want to keep expanding my vocabulary, mastering nuances, and refining my pronunciation. I want to delve deeper into English literature, enjoy movies without subtitles, and engage in meaningful conversations that enrich my life. Looking back at how far I've come, I can't help but feel proud of the progress I've made. From that person who struggled to piece together sentences to someone who can hold conversations with confidence, the transformation has been remarkable. It's a testament to the power of hard work, dedication, and belief in oneself. So, to all the learners out there, remember that the journey is just as important as the destination. Embrace each moment, cherish every small victory, and keep pushing through the challenges. Learning a language is not just about acquiring skills. It's about discovering who you are, expanding your horizons, and opening doors to a world of possibilities.